So Melanie Harris, it's so wonderful to see you, be with you, and listen to your ideas this afternoon so that people watching this course on Christianity and ecology can understand one of the amazing contributions that you're making. But first, let me just say that you're the founding director of African American and Africana Studies and professor of religion and ethics at Texas Christian University, a full professor, the first African-American woman there at Texas Christian University. So congratulations on that. And we're so happy that you're part of the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology Advisory Group. And we've worked together over the years. And this wonderful book that, of course, many people know, but we want more to know, of Eco-womanism, that's in the series from Orbis Books on ecology and justice. And the subtitle, African American Women and Earth Honoring Faith. So that's what we're going to talk about here. And let's begin with even the idea of what is womanist theology? Shall we start there?
Thanks, Mary Evelyn, for the invitation to join you in conversation. It is a gift, and I am very, very grateful to you for your leadership and deep, deep compassion for the entire field. Truly, we would not be here without you all's work. Womanism really began as a movement of thinking about how we could shift intellectual thought. And what's significant, especially for religious studies, is that womanist thought did not begin as a religious term. It actually began out of the mind and out of the genius of a literary artist, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author, Alice Walker. And many people know her work in part because of the famous book, The Color Purple, and many, many of her amazing books. But her nonfiction work is actually where we begin to see the origins of where the term womanist came into play. And it really did start in the late 1970s as she was grappling with the tensions that she was experiencing, talking about race and gender and the intersections between those realities as well as economic realities in conversation with many white feminists. You all very, very much know probably just a little bit of the history and of American culture in the late 1970s and certainly in the 60s. There were several social movements going on, and one of those movements was the feminist movement. And that feminist movement really began to open up doors for women in a variety of different ways. But one of these spaces where women were having difficulty talking was about race and the intersections that a woman of color's experience, in Alice Walker's case, a Black woman's experience, was not the same as a white woman's experience, and particularly a white middle-class woman's experience. So the vocabulary that was used by womanists became very, very important for Alice to be able to embody and then later come to voice about. And she did so in a number of different essays before publishing a wonderful, wonderful book, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens. And the womanist definition appears on the very first page of that book. And it's a 4-part definition, really mapped on this kind of Webster dictionary format, whereby she really goes into the detail about how a womanist is different than a feminist, in part because of this intersectional reality and what we call complex subjectivity of who a person can be, a variety of different identities, a variety of different diverse perspectives in the same being.
Yes, marvelous. And what a great fountainhead Alice Walker is for all of us, isn't she? Extraordinary.
She is, yes.
Book on her is something we all need to return to, along with her writings. So thank you for that broad background just of the idea of womanist thought. Now let's move into, shall we, eco-womanist thought and how you stand at the center of that in so many ways. So give us a feel for that.
Eco-womanism is an approach to environmental ethics that really foregrounds the perspective, the genius, the ideas, the concepts, the religiosity and spirituality of women of African descent. And it is often in the environmental movement that we do not always include women of color and their voices, and particularly women of African descent, even though we have huge, huge models of ecological genius and certainly leaders in ecology throughout the world who are women of African descent. Nevertheless, one of the spaces in which in religion and ecology that really needed to grapple with this kind of intersection of race, class, gender, and beyond was really coming up with an approach that would allow all of us to think not just about environmental degradation and climate change, but also in relation to racial injustice and economic injustice. And so a frame that allows us to do that is eco-womanism. It's interesting, Mary Evelyn, that we started talking about Alice Walker, in fact, because as you know, my first book really was uncovering a lot of her nonfiction voice and recognizing so much of the social activism that she was a part of. She marched with King and so many others in the civil rights movement. But she was also one of the leading African-American voices in the environmental movement and went through a lot of kind of test and trial to be able to really signal that African-American communities and African-American people have just as much a right to be concerned about the planet as anyone else. Typically, and this is still the case today, one of the reasons why eco-womanism is so important is because an assumption and a myth is often construed that African Americans are always in tension and always fighting for racial justice, and therefore don't, quote unquote, have time, unquote, to be engaged in environmental and justice work. And that's untrue. We see from Alice Walker, but we also see from a variety of different authors and historians that African-American history is particularly tied to the environment and particularly tied to ecological justice. And Alice Walker really is a wonderful figure that allows us to get into this conversation on eco-womanism. So it was my study of her work actually that opened up these connections and this kind of reorientation to what eco-womanism means, not just for religious discourse, but also for all of us to talk about our own connections to the earth.
Yes, yeah. And that's why this 20-year-old series on ecology and justice is trying to do exactly that. Of course, imperfectly, because we're still all trying to make the deep connections and the inclusive voices and the powerful sensibilities that something like eco-womanism is bringing forward. And I reread your book for this interview and just got even more out of it the second time around. And I just want to underscore, I want to draw you out even more on the ecology and justice, environmental racism, environmental justice, the people and planet, and also to signal that Pope Francis's encyclical, right? The cry of the earth, the cry of the poor, which is also in this Orbis series. Leonardo Boff, the great liberation theologian, put that forward. And partly because Thomas Berry said, you can't save people without the earth, Leonardo. And so he was making that connect. Everyone's trying to make it, right? This connection. But right now, love to hear your thoughts again, or deeper, broader, on environment, people, planet, environmental justice, eco-justice, racism, and ecology, and so on.
Thank you. And I so appreciate you naming so many of those powerful thinkers, especially Pope Francis, and especially Thomas Berry. And I think that Berry in particular is a window and a huge space for us to be able to settle into, in part because it was very early that he began to make observations about the variety of religious doors that are open to this ecological conversation, and how we all have different relationship and different stories and different understandings based on our religion and the religious stories that we live out about how to and whether to take care of the earth. It is important to recognize that for many in the environmental movement, the earth is actually considered deeply, deeply sacred, a sacred part of the community. In fact, earth is often considered a mother or the creator or akin and a very, very deep part of God, using Christian language. In many indigenous traditions, especially Native American, but also African indigenous religious traditions, it is really important to actually have this reciprocal and honored relationship with the earth. That is to say, there is a mandate, so to speak, a rule or a guideline to take care of the earth, in part because as you're taking care of the earth, you are also taking care of the community, of each other, of oneself, and certainly taking care of the ancestral or the spiritual realm. That kind of African cosmology, which shows up in a number of different indigenous religious traditions, of course, is the kind of cosmology that serves as a foundation for eco-womanism. It honors the earth as sacred, which means that it's not just about environmental policy. It's not just about urban gardening. It's not just about getting food. It's also about how we are in ethical communion with the earth and with each other. When it comes to racism and the reality of the history of white supremacy in the United States of America and across the globe, one thing that we know is that white supremacy is not healthy for the planet. It's not healthy for human relationships. And racism is not healthy for human relationships. In fact, it is a break, right? Or a breaking down of the ability to see another as a fully important and valued being on the planet. When we have that reality, which is so much a part of American culture, racism, it becomes important then to be able to see any act of racism, any act of the breaking down of relationships based on a racist idea or a white supremacist frame, and recognize there's a deep connection between the logic of domination in that frame and the logic of domination involved in the frame between the earth and humans. Oftentimes that logic of domination means that in many religious traditions, for example, we have the understanding that humans were created to have power and dominion over the earth, that they can use the earth in whatever way that they want to, without any repercussions and without any consequences. And we know from the science and from the reality of climate change that that is not true. That any kind of religious trope that leads one to believe that there are no consequences is actually inaccurate. Eco-womanism helps us to recognize that inaccuracy and begins to help us to think, how can we live in communion with each other that would be healthy also for the earth? And for many of us, that means fighting social justice, means also fighting for earth justice. Fighting for racial justice means also fighting for earth justice.
Yes. And I was very involved in the civil rights movement back in the 60s and the anti-Vietnam War. And, it was pretty tense then. And we're still feeling the consequences, still trying to unfold the arc in the direction of justice and so on. It's going to be a lifetime process, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, but what I really also want to draw out from you, because of your appreciation for Thomas Berry and his teaching of the religions to us, to John and me, which is why we're picking that up, but also his feeling for cosmology. And we've been able to interview several African historians of religion, like Jacob Olopona and so on, and other indigenous practitioners. So you say in your book, and you just said now, that we have a lot to learn, don't we, from Africana cosmologies. And so can we pick up there and give us a feel for what?
Yes, that's so helpful. I'm so grateful to you and John in part because really you all have spearheaded this open door that has actually been very, very important for us recognizing that oftentimes the United States, at least in the academy, we're trained to not listen to Indigenous voices, unfortunately. And it's sometimes we're trained to listen to them with a particular kind of colonial lens. That is to say that the assumption often is that the Indigenous people's wisdom is not as important and not as valid as a Western European kind of frame or point of view.
Right.
What I love about the work that you all have done, and certainly the valuing of African cosmologies, is that it actually places the African cosmology at the base, at the foundation, that one actually has to recognize that for a cosmology of that sort, it's not just an intellectual exercise, that in fact one has a spirituality and a moral component to the way that they are actually in conversation and in relationship with the earth and with each other. That is to say, for anyone just coming into the understanding of African cosmology, there's a deep understanding about the web of life, so to speak, that the ancestors and spirituality, angels, so to speak, even God, exists in one realm, and that realm is deeply connected to a human realm where we live as people and as persons in community with each other. In addition, there's another realm in cosmology, and that's the realm of nature and the earth. And only by these three components, and sometimes in different indigenous traditions there are even more, but only by them being in mutual conversation and in mutuality with each other does the earth actually move forward in a peaceful way. Peace is always the goal. Peace is always the trajectory. And so what we can find from an African cosmology, there are very many different virtues and values that are kind of placed into position to help us to live towards that kind of peace. And one of those most important principles and values is justice. The value of being able to create a space where all actually have access to the full flourishing of life on the planet, in addition to Earth.
Yes, that's so beautiful, so rich. And there's so many different directions here. It's very inspiring. And I felt in my own experience, the struggle for justice in the 60s was almost heartbreaking. And I was in DC when Martin Luther King was killed. I saw the natural and I saw the inner city erupt, and our cities across the country erupt with despair, with anger, with frustration. And that was a time when I was also looking for something deeper, more lasting, this profound, deep time. And what I find so rich in your work, and you bring it up with your grandmother, your mother's mother, but this deep sense of eco-memory, right? That and that the earth has the potential, of course, the burdensome side for African American women and the beauty side, these tensions. But I'd love just to draw you out, because cosmology, as you've just said, it's not abstract. It's these profound memories that we carry. So tell us what eco-memory is for you.
Ecological memory, or eco-memory, is individual but also collective memory that we have about our relationship with the earth. And what that can mean is that it is the relationship that your peoples had with the earth, the people from whom you descend. It can also mean that there are memories in you, in your body, and maybe in your heightened consciousness about how you relate to the earth. So oftentimes, as one of the steps of the Eco-womanist method, we invite people to honor their own experience. And for many of us, we have some positive experience about being in nature. I know that particularly over the past few months, of the past 10 months during the COVID pandemic, there has been a lot of grief and a lot of loss. But many people who have been confined to a home area or not able to travel have actually found that the earth right around them, walking, going to the park, has been deeply rejuvenating and has been a space of community, even in the midst of feeling isolated and not being able to go and do the things one would, quote unquote, normally do. That connection that people are finding with the earth is the source of an eco-memory. It is essentially opening the door to everyone's own experience of some kind of communion or special connection with nature, special connection with the earth. For eco-memory in an African-American sense, and certainly for eco-womanism, that memory runs deep, very deep, not only into the individual, but also into all the generations before that individual actually came into being. So when we think about African-American eco-memory, what we're talking about here is not just one stroll through the park, but also one's mother and grandfather and the generations of people who worked with the earth. As an African-American who actually has a history and a connection to many different farmers, but also sharecroppers and also enslaved African realities of being enslaved as a people, it is important for eco-womanism to recognize that our relationship with the earth is paradoxical. I use the work of Kimberly Ruffin here in terms of the beauty and burden paradox, that there is a sense in which there can be a deep, deep valuing and a deep, deep beauty in being with the earth. But there's also this burden, this difficulty of a relationship, because it really forces us to recognize that in our relationship with the earth, there's also been this reality of white supremacy, the entanglement, the reality of slavery and being enslaved. And so to actually come to voice with a healthy connection with the earth, eco-womanism really presents an invitation to go back to those eco-memories and essentially to heal them by engaging in the work of environmental justice.
Yeah. Beautiful. And, you also speak about earth spirituality, this deep connection to nature. And I'm presuming everyone has access to that, but tell us your sense of what is earth spirituality?
It's a great question. I appreciate the work of Thomas Berry here in particular, but also the work, of course, of Alice Walker and many, many other proto-womanists and many womanists. Here, I actually like the example of Harriet Tubman, because as we all know, Harriet Tubman was really a warrior in the Underground Railroad. And what we're learning now more about her life is that she, in fact, would fall into spells because of an accident that she was involved with where an iron literally hit her head. She would later in life fall into spells in the midst of a route, making sure that enslaved African peoples could get towards freedom. In those spells, it's understood that she would have some kind of divine experience, hearing from the ancestors or hearing directly from God, and that upon coming out of those spells, she would know exactly where to go and how to lead the people around slave catchers, etc. Harriet Tubman also becomes a really important figure for earth spirituality in that she herself was a powerful environmentalist. She literally read trees in order to know which side the moss was growing and which way north was. And when we think about her in that lens, as Dorcetta E. Taylor reminds us, we recognize that actually African-American history has been a deep part of environmental history, much, far back than many of us actually thought about. So
Yeah.
Harriet Tubman is one who's really, her spirituality was kind of mapped into her consciousness around the earth, and her earth consciousness was mapped into her spirituality.
Yes, yes. And the film that came out on her, of course, is so powerful, isn't it, in those ways? And just to extend what you say, not to the extent that Harriet had those experiences, but everyone loves the sunset, right? Everyone loves the sunrise, or people love to go up to a mountaintop or to the beach and feel the waves. So most people have access, right, to earth spirituality. We just don't name it and affirm it fully, wouldn't you say?
I think that's right, Mary Evelyn. We do not affirm it. And over the history of Christianity, it's actually been thought of as completely devalued, right? And in a negative way, considered heresy, considered an act of heresy, considered pagan-like. And in part because of that dualism within Christianity around environmental justice work, Eco-womanism is a really important corrective and an invitation for us to re-examine Christian theology, in part because of that dualism between the earth and spirit. We end up losing the opportunity to value the connection with the earth that, in fact, for many people is deeply spiritual. I know that for many, we have found God in the earth, in the sunset, as you just said, in our connection with trees. And as we begin to articulate that in a formal kind of Christian theological sense, oftentimes there's some pushback. And there's a question about, well, where does the Trinity fit in exactly? Now, certainly we have wonderful scholars in Christian theology who actually help us to understand the depth of the connection between one's Christianity, one's connection with the earth, and the love and spirituality that's there. But that wasn't always the case. And so really grateful for how far the field has come.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And the sense, gosh, we could say so much from that comment alone, but how does deep time invite us into a logos experience of all of creation? Or, why is it that we lost that sense of creation as primary, not just redemption, as Thomas Berry used to put it? But also Willie Jennings here at Yale is talking about, where is our doctrine of creation in Christianity? So we have a long way to go, don't we?
We do, and it's an exciting time to be in the conversation and to be thinking about it. I can imagine for many people coming to this course, this may be the first class that they're taking in any kind of, religious thinking or thinking about their spirituality differently. And I think that this conversation in Christian theology is actually a way in. It does signal that Christianity doesn't have all the answers about creation.
Yeah.
That actually, as Thomas Berry invites us to think more deeply about, that there are a variety of different religious traditions, including Buddhism and indigenous religious traditions, that help us to open the door to what in Buddhism is called Buddha nature. And it's that aha that you see and you feel every time you open your eyes to a beautiful sunset or a beautiful sunrise. That aha is the recognition of your own true nature, your own true self, which is the essence of life itself, the essence that Earth explores every single moment.
Yes, beautiful, beautiful. Well, as we conclude here, although I'd like to go on all afternoon, how do you see Christian seminaries or Christian ministers, priests, etc., beginning to absorb this? Is this actually going to go down to the pews, as they say? What's your...
It's a great question, and I think it's an individual, but also obviously a communal question. One of the ways I think many of us are coming to ask this question is to ask ourselves, what responsibility do we have to be sure that everyone has equal access to the beauty of the earth?
Mm-hmm.
In some ways, this is a basic food justice question, because not everyone has access to fresh produce and fresh food in our cities and certainly in our country. We have a variety of different kinds of food deserts and a number of different where spaces in which access to clean air is not a guarantee, to clean water is not a guarantee. So on an individual basis, I think we can begin to ask ourselves, how does my own religiosity or spirituality begin to explore how I ought to help create an earth connection for everyone that is beautiful, so that everyone has access to the full beauty of the earth. When it comes to seminaries and theological education centers, and especially churches, because many Christian churches understand the gospel of Jesus Christ to be one of taking care of others, and especially those who are marginalized and oppressed, there really is a kind of clear mandate within Christianity to then take this question of environmental access and access to creation's beauty to the next level. And that essentially is a level to move into an earth justice or earth honoring faith perspective. So we begin that in a number of different ways. Churches often are invited to do an audit, an environmental audit of their own space, the religious space where people in normal times come together to worship. Are there windows where people can actually see creation during worship? Are there spaces for the children to be able to imagine God as nature? Or are there so many closed windows and so many closed doors that the space and the imagination itself really is locked into only envisioning God in a particular way? When we see those kinds of tropes, we know that we're probably moving in the wrong direction, that God is much bigger than a building, and that God is really, really, really so deeply, deeply valued. And we can understand God in a variety of different ways. So I think those are some of the ways we actually are invited as churches to take a look at the doctrine that we already have, the missionary, commitments that we've already taken, and to ask ourselves a bit more about what would Jesus say and how would Jesus lead us in this particular time.
Right, right. So an expansion of all these traditions, or what we like to say, retrieval and re-examining in present circumstances, and reconstruction. So that's the exciting thing. And I love to think of this as an intergenerational handshake. And to you and to our students, our collective students, and things will change for sure with new blood, new ideas, openness, and that's, I think, very hopeful. Yeah, so maybe we'll just can conclude with anything more about. I love this term, of course, earth honoring faith. It's in your book. Larry Rasmussen has used it. I know you worked with him at Ghost Ranch for 10 years on these various summer conferences, but anything else you'd like to add here, Melanie, on earth honoring faith, or the openings that you see going forward?
Sure. I think it's a deep invitation for everyone to revisit their connection with the earth and to not be overwhelmed by the reality of climate change in front of us. I know for me, even as a scholar and a young scholar, I was intimidated by the science of it. And so the door that I felt like I could move into it was a door of religious tradition, and asking myself the connection of what it was in my own spirituality that was really ignited by being in nature and having connection with the earth. If that's your way in, then welcome it. Come on into the work and come on in, because that's a really important space. And it's not to negate the science. It's actually to invite us into the door that's most comfortable, and then to learn the science, right, as we move along. Oftentimes in our Western way of thinking, we separate science and religion, and actually the climate crisis that we're in necessitates that we put them in conversation with each other.
Yeah. That's perfect. What a great way to end. I couldn't agree more. And I think that new conjunction, new and old, but the mutually enhancing dimensions, right, of science and religion, of ethics and ecology, will give energy and juice so that we don't burn out. We can draw on this beauty that surrounds us, as well as the struggle for justice. So, Melanie, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Grateful to you.
Good to be with you. Thank you so much, Mary Evelyn. Blessings on you.
The same. Thank you.
Thanks.